The overall challenges, I think, are really urbanisation and climate change, because the world is urbanising so very rapidly, and most of that growth is going to move into the cities. I mean, at the moment, cities are half the world's population, or half the world's population lives in urban areas, but by 2050, we're expecting over 2/3 to. And that means that one's putting a fantastic strain on a lot of the resources of a city. And we're already looking at water scarcity, energy shortages coming in the future, and of course food shortages. And all this really is driven by population growth. But at the same time, that extra consumption means that, and that extra consumption of resources means that the footprint goes up of the cities. And it means the CO2 and the greenhouse gases go up, and the waste goes up. So there's a huge issue around that. And these are the kind of big challenges for cities. What the nations need to know is that there is actually such a thing as climate prosperity. That if you actually were to stimulate a low carbon recovery, you could actually, through that, create climate prosperity. And that protecting against climate change, mitigating climate change, is good for the economy. It's good for competitiveness. It's good for productivity. And above all, something that really matters to politicians, it's good for quality of life. And it's the quality of life that actually attracts people to cities and makes them want to stay there. Cities are, of course, they are a huge part of the problem, urban areas. But they also are part of the solution, because they can use and share resources very efficiently, which means that, in fact, they're very capable of actually reducing their carbon footprint. And the other thing is that they control many of the services which are actually crucial to the big CO2 emitters, which are energy, waste, water and transport. And also, they're also very important in terms of planning and development. So they control often, they always control the development of land, the planning of buildings. All city governments own buildings, own fleets, and have very big procurement powers. And all this means that they have many of the services, the responsibilities and the levers to actually reduce emissions. Well, cities are doing as much as they can with the levers that they've got, but they still need powers and regulations which they themselves can't make at a city level. To give you one example, I can't think of a city in the world that actually is able to really satisfactorily deal with making its existing buildings energy efficient. You can do it in not absolutely right across the city, which is what needs to happen. Just to give you one example. So cities need more resources. Many of them need to redo the environmental infrastructure, which is high carbon, and they need to redo it so it's low carbon, whether it's energy, whether it's waste, whether it's water, whether it's transport. It needs redoing. And they need the resources to do that. If you had proactive mandatory legislation, like you did, for instance, in Britain in 1956, when you had the Clean Air Act introduced, because in fact people were dying from the smogs, and you had low carbon zones rolled out. Now, if you had something like that, say for Britain, if you had a Clean Air Act and low carbon zones rolled out to mirror those smokeless zones, you could actually, you could retrofit, or you could make all the buildings in this country energy efficient, and you could bring together energy supply, because you could help individuals to be mini power stations, and you could help communities to control their own energy. But the point I'm trying to make is that you would need proactive mandatory legislation to do that, and I think people would welcome it. Well, the first thing is they have to have vision. They absolutely have to be able to put across a vision of the future of their city. Not short-term vision, but a long-term vision, so people know what they're aiming for. The second thing is they have to have they have to be courageous. They have to have political will. They absolutely have to make difficult decisions. The third thing is that they have to have policies to make their cities, they have to have a good policy framework to make their cities sustainable. And this means that they've got to work systemically. It's not one silver bullet. You have to work across many fronts. Well, the first thing cities should do is they should create a policy framework for themselves, and they should have an action plan. Whether they call it a climate action plan or a climate prosperity plan, action plan, it's important that you have a plan which shows how you're going to reduce emissions. And you have to know where your emissions come from, and you have to say, we're going to do this with transport, because it's in London it's 22% of emissions. We're going to do this with our building stock, because our homes are the biggest source of emissions, 38%, and our businesses are nearly as much. And then you have to look at how you're going to green your energy supply. And all that has to be set out in a plan, and you can do that right now. And you can try and do as much as possible. So you've got to do something to get people out of the car. Leaving room for the buses to get around, which is much more, equity. I mean, where was choice for people who didn't have a car before? I mean, the buses were also stuck in the gridlock. Now the buses really can zip around. We've really improved that service. And men in pinstripe suits come up to me and say, I would never now take my car. It's better by bus. We know the impact of climate change will affect millions of people around the world in the next decade. And it will affect our children and our grandchildren. And it's astonishing that people can allow themselves to think short term and just think of the next election. And that's why we need politicians to really work across party on climate change. And we need the whole spectrum, political spectrum, from left to right, to actually get climate change and understand that this is the generation, the now generation. This is the generation that understands the science, that has the technology, that has the knowledge. It's the first generation that has it, and it's the last generation to be able to do anything about the battle against climate change. Because if we don't do it, it'll be too late. My dream is that this will be transformative. This tremendous challenge, this challenge of runaway climate change, will lead, in a way, to runaway learning, to runaway collaboration within streets, within communities, within cities, between cities, across the world, globally. And that we will actually, in a sense, find something transformative about it. And it will shift our values, or put a spotlight on some of the values that perhaps have been rather hidden in the past. Solidarity, collectivity, valuing each other.